Big Things Come in Small Packages. A short story by Eleonora E. Tate. Part 1. I want to tell you about a boy I knew who lived in Morehead City, North Carolina, some years ago, named Tucker Willis. He lived by Calico Creek, where it narrows down to marsh grass, flounder, and fiddler crabs. It's not far from the backside of the Morehead City Port Terminal, where the big ships come in from the Atlantic Ocean. Everybody liked him, and he was good at almost everything he put his hand to. But when Tucker turned 11 or 12, he was still so short he looked like an elf. And you know how it is when you're a little different from other folks, in even some harmless kind of way. Kids called him Tom Thumb, Squirt, Midget, Inchworm, Dwarf. I thought Tucker was the cutest little thing in the world, but to him back then I was old knock-kneed Lashana May, the girl who lived down the street. I was a couple years younger than him. We were friends, though, and went to the same church, St. Luke's Missionary Baptist, and the same school. Back in those days, in the 1970s, young boys and girls didn't hang out as boyfriend and girlfriend like kids do now. Plus, I was just a skinny girl with braids and braces. Kids called me Wires because of those braces, and boy, did it ever make me mad. So Tucker and I had a lot in common, and lots of times we talked about the things kids called us, especially when we went fishing. Even though being called those names hurt, Tucker gave up fighting the kids who said them. Fighting didn't help. The name-callers were all too big for him to beat up. So after a while, he learned to ignore the teasing. Most times he laughed it off. He was a tough little dude. But oh mercy, how he hated those names. One day, Tucker did something that made everybody stop calling him names he didn't like. I think it helped him grow a few inches, too. You need to know a few things about this boy before I tell you what changed things around. Tucker could do almost anything that any other kid his age could do. He was a hotshot shortstop on the Little League baseball team. He could jump like a flea on the basketball court. He was smart in school, he was in the Boy Scouts, he could swim like a fish, and even surf. He looked like a Tootsie Roll to me in that big ocean. Yeah, I had a name for him, too. I called him Tootsie Roll, but never to his face. I just kept it to myself. And when I called him that in my head, I didn't mean it in a bad way. Tucker could do some fishing. He especially liked to fish his folks' little pier alongside their house. In the summertime, he'd lie on his stomach on the pier and catch some of the biggest flounder to come out of Calico Creek. Instead of a rod and reel, he used a handful of fishing line, a hook baited with shrimp, and a sinker to keep the bait from floating on the surface. He'd dangle that shrimp an inch or two off the bottom, right in front of a flounder's nose. Sometimes we'd fish together on his pier, and I wouldn't catch diddly squat, not even a pinfish, not even a lizardfish, nothing. But old Tootsie Roll could catch 'em. I tried fishing the way he did, but most of the time I used a rod and reel, 'cause I thought the way Tucker did it was country. I still couldn't catch anything, not in Calico Creek. I did all right when I fished at the pier in Atlantic Beach. That's how I'd see Tucker surfing. He even got teased about surfing, because not many black kids we knew surfed. Shoot, as much as we all loved the water, not a whole lot of us even knew how to swim. Not until Tucker taught me later on. He and his dad or mom would fish out on their own little pier all night sometimes with a Coleman lantern for light. His folks used regular rods and reels. I never fished out there at night with them because the mosquitoes and the gnats would about eat me up. Plus, my mama liked to tell me that they used to do baptizing in that creek, which was okay. But then Mama'd say, "Lashana May, you watch out about being around that creek by yourself at night. The people who got baptized there and who have passed on come back to that creek as spirits in the middle of the night when the moon's full. They'll be singing and celebrating and shouting and praising, and they don't want to be disturbed. Unless you want to join in with them." Me being a scared little kid, you can believe that Mama didn't have to worry about me going out to nobody's Calico Creek by myself at night. But sometimes I'd go to my window at night and look out to see if anybody was celebrating the way she said. All I ever saw were grown folks fishing. Sometimes somebody would holler when they caught a big one. After I got grown, I understood that Mama told me that story to try to help me stay out of trouble. She was worried I'd drown or get into some kind of foolishness. Well, it worked. I knew that it was easy to get into trouble when you're out someplace where you're not supposed to be. Anyway, what happened to change all the name-calling started when Tucker was on his pier trying to catch a flounder. He noticed a man standing on the Moton Motel dock just a few yards from him. That man had a thick white mustache and Van Dyke beard and wore a blue and gold military-style jacket and cap. I wasn't there, so I didn't see him, but that's what Tucker told me. When the man waved, Tucker, being a friendly kind of kid, waved back. They struck up a conversation. The man said his name was Richard and that he was staying at the motel for a few days. His home was in Manteo, on Roanoke Island, not far from the Outer Banks, where he worked with the U.S. Life-Saving Service. Tucker figured what he meant was that he was with the U.S. Coast Guard. Tucker was pretty knowledgeable about the Coast Guard, but he had never heard of this life-saving service. Tucker asked the man if he liked to fish. Richard said yes. He'd been a commercial fisherman before he became a captain in the life-saving service. As a lifesaver, he said, he and his men went into the ocean in the middle of hurricanes and nor'easters to save passengers and crew members whose ships were sinking. Of course, anything about water fascinated Tucker, so he must have asked this Richard a million questions. Richard didn't seem to mind, though. He said he didn't get to talk to kids much anymore. Richard said a good crewman had to be strong, an excellent swimmer, a quick thinker and in good physical health, have good eyesight and understand how dangerous the sea can be. He told so many stories about life-saving that Tucker wished he could enlist right away and said so. He had the right qualifications, other than being too young, of course, and too short. Richard told him it wasn't the size of a person that got the job done. It was how bad the person wanted to do it. How were those huge ships 2 and more stories high able to move into the Moorhead City port and back out to sea? Most couldn't do it without little tugboats pushing and pulling them in, Richard said. A tugboat could bring in a ship many times its size. Richard said that Tucker would make a good tugboat and one day might even grow up to be a big ship. He thanked Tucker for the conversation, said maybe they'd meet again, and then the man wandered off back toward the motel. Tucker said for the rest of the afternoon he thought over what Richard had said. A few days later, Tucker decided to go with his dad to the Atlantic Beach Pier to fish. His daddy worked there as a cook. For some reason, I couldn't go that day. I've always wished I had. Tucker said he took his surfboard, too, in case fishing got slow. It was early morning, but a hot July wind blew in from the southwest, making the waves choppy and sandy.
The tide was going out. Hardly anybody was on the pier, which was another hint that the fish might not be biting. Tucker said only one guy was in the water, floating on a red raft like a huge jellyfish.
The tide was going out. Hardly anybody was on the pier, which was another hint that the fish might not be biting. Tucker said only one guy was in the water, floating on a red raft like a huge jellyfish. After a good hour had passed and he hadn't got a bite, Tucker left his rod and reel with his father in the pier restaurant's kitchen and went surfing. After he swam out far enough, he climbed onto his surfboard and rode a wave in. When he glanced back at the pier, guess who he saw? His new friend Richard on the pier, clapping for him. At least this time he had on shorts and a regular shirt. Tucker said he bet Richard had about burnt up in that heavy uniform the other day. Richard hollered, "Do it, tugboat! Pull that old wave in!" Tugboat? Tucker said he frowned until he remembered Richard's story about tugboats. So he waved back and swam out to pull in another one, passing the man on the raft. The man said, "You're kind of little to be way out here, ain't you, Squirt?" Tucker just shook his head and kept going. Tucker pulled in 4 more waves until he noticed a tall purple thunderhead rising up on the southwest horizon. That cloud meant a storm was probably on its way, but Tucker figured he had at least half an hour before the wind kicked up the waves and blew the cloud in and the rain began. Tucker wasn't afraid of a thing, but his common sense and his folks had told him to always leave away from water when storms and lightning come along. It's hard to get grown without having common sense, because being stupid can get you killed sometimes.